Hi, and welcome to another episode of Idea Collider. This is actually a slightly unusual podcast in that the author that we're talking with on the book is Biotech in the Time of COVID-19, Commentaries from the Front Line. It's different in that it's edited by Dr. Jeremy Levin, and with contributions from really the great and the good of the biotech and the pharma space, including Sam Waxall, Ron Cohen, George Scangos, Christy Shore, John Marganor, just a really impressive lineup of folks he was able to convince to contribute their thoughts and their voices to this book. Jeremy is the chairman and CEO of Ovid Therapeutics, which company whose mission is focused on patients with rare neurological conditions. He's also the chairman of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, which point will become relevant as you listen to this podcast. Previously president and CEO of Teva, and was at BMS when he was the architect of what is a relatively famous string of pearls strategy, which transformed Bristol Myers Squibb's fortune. So I'll hand over and let Jeremy introduce. Welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider, the Pharma Book Club. And I'm delighted this week to have the opportunity to interview someone who not only has just published the book, but it's about the last few months. And it reads like this remarkable historical piece, but it's about 3 months ago. And I think we all know that time has expanded dramatically in the last few months. So I'm delighted to introduce Jeremy Levin. Jeremy, first of all, could you tell us something about you and your reasons for writing the book?
Mike, thank you for having me. The reason that I wrote the book was that this is a time that we should not forget. It's a time when, as you said, a lot of things get telescoped and suddenly what was today seems years ago. And what is tomorrow, we have no idea what it will be. So it's really the sense of time today is very strange. And what was the reason that I decided we must do this was, to my absolute amazement and astonishment, the entire industry pivoted in a period of time from January through to March. And in that period of time, you saw a complete change in the way people were reacting, what they were doing, where money was flowing into the industry. And I thought if we didn't capture that moment, it would really be a shame for the fact that we would lose the teachings that were coming from it. So the bottom line was, this was a unique moment of change, and we needed to capture it so that when we look back, we could learn from it.
And it reads that way. It's fascinating to watch what is a relatively broad sweep, and I encourage everyone to go buy the book and read it. But the perspectives that it takes, you have people talking about their inside experience, personal experiences, investor experiences, non-pharmaceutical experiences. That sweep, I think, was also an interesting perspective.
Yes, and the whole concept is that biotechnology is a set of tools that you use to unpack a biological problem. The question was, when we face a problem, what are the different perspectives that you bring to dealing with that problem, and that these tools offer you to think about it? And it's not obvious types of tools, so to speak. They're not physical things sometimes. They're ethics. They're perspectives on how you manage people. They're perspectives on how you observe what's going on in society around you. And all of that translates into the sharp edge of drug discovery at the end of the day, or vaccine discovery, or diagnostic test discovery. And if you capture those perspectives, you can begin to have an understanding of the interrelatedness of all the components of this industry. So for me, it's really weaving a carpet, a cloth with many different threads, but the idea behind it is that you provide a very rich understanding of different perspectives. And some, people may disagree with them. Others they will resonate with. But the fact is, we're all different, and everybody has a perspective, and one needs to listen to those perspectives if you have a hope of finding a route through that everybody will actually feel is the route that is going to get us to the best place the fastest.
And from your perspective as an editor of the book, did you give the individuals specific briefs, or did they respond to a simple question in their own way?
No, I gave them one message. It is your voice. Use it. And I absolutely refused to guide them in their decision making or their thinking, with one exception. And I'll come to that in a minute. My whole purpose was to capture specific individual thinking. It wasn't to give them a mandate to write about. I don't. One can argue that that's a good way to go in certain perspectives. If you're trying to do a mechanical book, then I'm sure that's the right thing to do. Write about how you built this component for this machine. That's not what I was trying to accomplish. What I wanted to accomplish was to hear their voice, their personal, independent, unbiased voice, and I actually never showed them any of the others. Never.
Okay.
Nobody saw anybody else's essay.
Yeah.
With the one exception I mentioned was Fred Frank. And one of the interesting things about history is that you can forget people, and that's a mistake. There are wonderful people in our industry that I won't have the chance to have captured their voice, Henry Tamir being one. Fred Frank is somebody who is a remarkable originator of the industry, and people who are not, as one ages, one pays less and less cognizance of what they're doing, but their role in history should never be forgotten. And Fred's role was very specific. If we think back 30 years, the day that Roche invested in and created what was called the Genentech transaction was an epochal moment for the industry. And so if you can have the advantage of capturing somebody's mind like that, getting their voice, then I'll do it any which way. So there I did. I confess there I had a set of questions I wanted answered.
Yeah. And that came across, that really the origin of the biotech industry. And I was struck probably here by what I'm going to say is the difference between the biotech mindset and the pharma mindset. And I know you represent bio, but I couldn't have imagined this book being written by pharma as an organization or its members in the way that this was, that it captured that humanity.
Mike, I would agree with you. This is not a book about large companies or small companies. This is about people who are innovative, people who think about patients, and people who think about how their organizations work within society. And that, in that regard, you should view me. I mean, I have run a large company. I had 50,000 people working for me, and I chose, when I left that, not to run another one like that, but rather to go to a small company, because there's something very rich, very tough, very tough, but very enriching in standing on the principles of being close to a patient, of being close to innovation, and of believing that and living the talk that your company is part of society. Large companies have great difficulty, Mike, doing that. They have many of the attributes I've discussed. There's no doubt in my mind that they have the ability to drive the association with patients. But when you have 150,000, 200,000 people, and your shareholders are demanding that you produce something every year, every day, your ability to be innovative, your ability to truly enrich is dependent on being able to dialogue with small companies and absorb what they have. It's absolutely dependent on that. And we can see that. 70% of all medicines do come, as you know, from the smaller companies. That's not to say that they can do this by themselves. In fact, to the contrary, the larger companies have a very clear and fundamental role in the industry. And it's not necessary, it's to enable that innovation. It is part of the ecosystem of enablement. So, to your point, it's highly unlikely another trade organization could do this, but perhaps not just for the reasons I've said, for another reason entirely. Bio represents biotechnology innovation organization. It doesn't say anything about the kind of product. And in that umbrella, you have medicines, you have foods, you have agricultural approaches, and you have environmental. And each one of these are captured in smaller or larger part in the book because they each had an impact.
Yeah, yeah, and that was interesting. You know, you had those counterpoints of, say, the food chain or the kind of the emerging markets. Just on the point that you made there, I was struck by the kind of difference. There's almost a juxtaposition in the book, two chapters. We have Moderna's response, and then you have a sort of Pfizer statement of what they were going to do, and that I noticed that, you know, in silico and others were talking about moving very early and very quickly in January to get stuff moving, to work with China to do whatever it was, or Moderna's approach to collaboration early in January, and your voice was out there in January. Some companies were starting to respond in March and April. And it almost seemed that juxtaposition was interesting as well, but that speed of response, but also recognizing the problem, seemed to be another theme that came through this book.
Mike, recognizing and acknowledging that this problem was one that we knew was going to come. This wasn't something new. We knew 10 years ago that we were going to face this. It was evident. SARS, H1N1, all of these were a clarion call. And as you look at the period of time that built up, say, from October last year through to January, what is utterly striking is the fact that within the United States, there were so few responses on a public health basis, almost none in the political environment. None of the levers that could be pulled were pulled to stop this. None of the levers were activated to say, what did we learn from H1N1, SARS, and all the preparedness that we had over the years that have gone by, expecting this. It's not as if it was a strange thing. So, when you think about that, the message that was consistently being conveyed, and history will, I'm sure, validate this, from October through to the end of January into February, this was considered to be somebody else's problem. Politically, we made so few commitments to solve this early on. Now, we can discuss the degree to which people focus on China's secretiveness and control of it. That's certainly an aspect of it. But the reality is, China aside, we had all the tools in place ourselves to take action. and we didn't.
Hmm.
And as it swept through China and then Europe, we were not making the moves we could do.
And there's an interesting chapter here where, discusses the NIH, the CDC, the FDA's response being, poor this time around. So certainly the book stands with constructive criticism of some of those agencies that you would depend on in the United States.
Well, I think there's a standout amongst all of those, actually. There's several standouts that are really positive. So if you look at the response of the FDA, outstanding. If you look at the response of NIH and particularly Dr. Fauci, absolutely outstanding. If you look at the initial responses of BARDA prior to the unfortunate events that led to its leadership being changed, really remarkable. So there are many different aspects which are very good. And if you look at the CDC, you have to ask some hard questions. But recall that for the first 2, 3, 4 months of this, it was regarded as a political problem. Across much of the media, this was seen as a political and not a medical problem, not a public health problem. And as a consequence of which, I think some of the agencies were probably reluctant to move forward in the way that they could do. But I have to say, and I think we all have to acknowledge, that there's nothing that that the FDA or NIH have anything to be concerned about. This was or ashamed of. They reacted as best they could under the circumstances. And the CDC had many of the things that it could use and didn't, for reasons that I'm sure will come out over time.
Yeah. And as you say, the things to be prepared for, I think Steve Holtzman in the book makes a very good point about, returning to this new normal or getting back to normal may not be the goal that we have as we come out of this, that there are improvements that we can see within the industry's response, but also potentially the way the US healthcare system works. And certainly there's an interesting part of the book goes into the US healthcare system.
Well, Mike, the US healthcare system was the one that bore the brunt of this right up front. So the idea that you'd be setting up tents in Central Park to accommodate patients flooding into Mount Sinai's hospital, this is almost as if you're in the Middle East, in the middle of a war zone. In fact, it was a war zone. You had physicians who were completely and totally untrained to dealing with it. The level of willingness to face that particular enemy and onslaught is nothing short of astonishing to me. And I think, that's another aspect of this entire event, which is yet to be written and needs to be written, is just how much they rose to the occasion. So I do think several things will change. And Steve is right, but amongst which is the terrible emotional experience in those first months actually, when physicians were triaging patients who would live, who would get what was thought at the time the right treatment, a ventilator, and we now know is not necessarily the best treatment. But imagine our medical system where we put a premium on saving lives, now having to ask these young doctors and nurses to triage between who lives and who dies. I think that in and of itself will occasion a lot of thinking in the medical, not the system, but the medical teaching. On the medical system itself, the preparedness and requirements of hospitals is very unusual. We have never thought of the idea that you should have showers on the outside of a hospital to decontaminate people who are coming into the hospital.
Right.
This kind of a thing is natural in, for example, Israel or Switzerland, where warfare is considered the norm. Here we've lived where medicine and the medical system has been a luxury, a profit-making entity, rather than a social service. And so I think some of the hospital systems who adapted so very rapidly are going to really be thinking through how they deal with this in the future. Because, Mike, it's coming again. Okay, this is not this is not the last pandemic.
Right. Yeah. We've had a couple of waves before this, and this one's become the one that that really has rocked the system, I guess.
It has, and we should expect that. We were taught about SARS, H1N1. We now have learned at a terrible price, and we're still going through it, what a pandemic actually means. And if we imagine that in the last 2 decades, this is the third time, what's to say that within 1 decade we have a fourth? This is nearly inconceivable that it won't happen. So everything we learn now must prepare us for what's coming. We need to fight this particular fight. We need to go back. We need to really understand all the errors that we did before. Everything. We need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? And then how do we actually prevent that happening again? Because it is coming.
And it's interesting that you used the book to kind of pull this out as well, is that some of what we know about the way that our industry responded or is responding, with potentially it could be better coordinated. I mean, that's the big risk, is we've got so many attempts at developing vaccines and therapeutics that we might run out of patients to truly bring something to market. But there was an interesting comment in the book about how the healthcare system and the pharmacy supply chain and so forth is in partnership now with people like Google and Amazon, being rebuilt with investments from those folks, because that idea that we think we know what it looks like until you get there and you start to work for one of those companies, that struck me as well. And given how much they're in charge of delivery of healthcare within our industry, that was a dramatic insight into the way that this works.
Mike, I think that's absolutely right. Healthcare has been evolving. I mean, we know, for example, that last year we crossed over a border where more than 50% of all physicians are now employed in a system. Similarly, there has been an enormous consolidation of hospitals across the nation, meaning that small outlying hospitals are really very different from what they were a year ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And then if you look at the consolidation that's occurring with the payers, it's nothing short of mind-boggling. Right now you have 4 or 5 that control 160 million lives. That's let alone Medicaid, Medicare. We're not talking about those. We're talking about private insurance. So when we think about that and compare it to what it was 10 years ago, the infrastructure underlying healthcare has fundamentally shifted to larger and larger organizations. Some of the most profitable businesses in the world are these hospital systems. They have to really rethink how they're going to deal with this in the future. But then you bring in the next point, the Googles, well, not the Google, and you have Amazon, and you have Walmart, all of whom are now able to deliver on a national, actually on a global scale, things that were never their provenance: healthcare, medicines. And in one way, we've seen the beginnings of this. We all can go to Walmart and get our Shingrix vaccine if we want. We can get all sorts of vaccines from them. The only way that you're going to distribute mass market vaccine is going to be through on the ground, not physicians, but facilities where you have the kind of pharmacies that can do this and are trained with skilled medical technicians to provide it. That's not the role of a big hospital. That's not the role of a doctor's office. You can certainly do that, but it's not necessary. So I think social media, social platforms, delivery platforms are going to change dramatically. And it's not inconceivable that if you look to the future, that you could have your own vaccine delivered to you, that you administer at home. That's exactly what happens with diabetics. It's a very interesting problem.
Yeah, and opportunity. I think for example, Quitter Highsmith's chapter about the kind of racial divides in the United States, the inequalities, does suggest that there are moves afoot to try and address, particularly with reference to COVID-19, but also with reference to everything else that we deal with. Is that maybe that democratization is going to be good for a bunch of people that the system currently isn't very good for.
Quitter Highsmith's article was, I think, an essay, was exceptionally important. It highlighted the disparity that exists in our society between different communities, and in that regard, it wasn't it is the core point to it, but at the same time, what it's basically telling you is that if we as a society are to succeed, then we must deal with this. And the pandemic has highlighted it in a way that is quite striking. And I have to compliment Genentech. Really, Alexander Hardy could have been the person to write this essay, but they chose not to do that. They chose a person who understands specifically what this means in different communities. And going back to your earlier question, Mike, a large company couldn't write this. Well, they did. This is where a large company said, the community matters to us. How medical disasters can affect the community is important to us. So that particular essay is a very important one for a number of different aspects, not least of which how Genentech, the company, responded, but much more importantly, that rather than having the most elevated person in the organization, they took a leader who focuses on populations. And I found that very important.
And it wasn't varnished, because I think with respect, certainly there are chapters in here that do read like a corporate affairs essay, and then there are some that are very human, that being one, and certainly, but that reflected the voices of people as opposed to the voices of corporations, I think, which was a real plus point for this book.
Well, voices of people were striking. And to give you an example of that, Jeff Kindler, Jeff ran Pfizer. This is somebody who ran one of the largest companies in the world. We all know Jeff, and we know that you would imagine that this would be somebody who would take a very corporate perspective. To the contrary, the impact of this pandemic was to demonstrate just how human we are. And Jeff chose to write a letter to his grandchild about what this period feels like. Because rather than write what he could have done, and he chose not to do it, he could have just written about what his company does or what other companies do, and he's very knowledgeable of that. But no, he understood fundamentally that this is a human moment, and one which we as a society, Mike, I think really need to take cognizance of, because the response as a society to this pandemic it will lay the grounds for how we respond to the next one.
Mm.
And that is at all levels. It's not just at the biotech industry. It starts in the streets with the families. Do you or don't you wear a mask?
Mm.
Is it cool to wear a mask or not cool to wear a mask? These are questions that adolescents are going to have to answer. Will you allow a government to shut you down so that you can do social distancing? Will you allow mass testing? Will you enforce mass testing? And, it's kind of interesting. If you go back many years ago, when we had no tools to deal with some of these disorders, be it tuberculosis, be it leprosy, we had a pretty defined way of dealing with this, identifying those who are ill and separating them from the population if you could. Over the years, we've forgotten those lessons because we've learned, perhaps to the benefit, that we feel we can tackle this and that all diseases are curable. Well, not all diseases are curable, and there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But an infectious disease is worse. It will infect you.
Yeah, and actually, I was struck because Alex Saveronkov's comment about being in JP Morgan in January, and I remember shaking hands with him there. And at the time, I was reading this book called Black Death at the Golden Gate, which talks to those points about, at this point, stopping people getting into the United States was the job of putting people on islands in San Francisco, and how you manage populations differently. And maybe his chapter does say maybe we should think about the ethics, because maybe China wasn't all bad in the way that it responded, or the way that South Korea managed its population to do non-pharmaceutical intervention as well as the kind of healthcare interventions.
Well, Alex is, as you know, a really extraordinary mind, and he will help change the industry, or at least the area that he's now so deeply embedded in will most certainly change the world that we're in. But I think the point that you make is that we need to distinguish between two different types of responses. One in Korea, where you have essentially a democratic nation that learned from its previous experiences, and with the support, encouragement, and belief of the population, enforced a set of steps which was extremely effective, but with general consensus. And therein lies a much better lesson than what we saw in China, where you effectively have a totalitarian government, which initially was extremely secretive and enclosed the population. I suspect that the Chinese population would have supported the government no matter what, but the initial reactions were those which were enforcing as opposed to supporting. And last night on the radio show that I was doing, I had somebody who wanted to point a finger and say, well, this is all China's fault. Well, no, their reaction was their reaction. The fact of the matter is, we had nothing. We didn't use our democracy to its strength. Our democracy is so strong that had we been able to mobilize the strengths of communication, of education, of infrastructure, we most certainly could have outdone what many people have experienced in other nations, because it's all here. But for reasons that we did not copy, or we did not learn from previously, as the Koreans did, the South Koreans. Don't know what's going on in North Korea.
No, and it's interesting because I suspect one of the goals I think this book can help fulfill is the reputational challenges for our industry. I think for me it has, if it's read, I think people will see two things. One is a largely transparent, open, and human set of responses. There's a lot of I don't know in here, as well as we do know, and trust us and believe us. So, and I think that's been interesting. But also, then you would come back and say, well, look, most of our hope is pinned on America and American companies being the solution to these challenges. Maybe with a bit of AstraZeneca sprinkled in, but it's largely an American innovation ecosystem that's driving this.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that figures speak it all. Over half of the total global response in terms of program are here in America. That's the numbers. There are approximately 600 programs, of which 250 plus are purely looking at older medicines. Now, there's some very valuable work going on in there. So, for example, that's the kind of work that threw up the positive result out of dexamethasone. It's also the work that threw out the spurious work that was done on hydroxychloroquine. Then there are two other groups, which represents about 150 each, plus or minus, groups of vaccines and new antivirals. That's the global picture. But a fully half of those and fully 70% of the innovative medicines and innovative trials are taking place in the United States. And you can contrast that to some really good trials in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, though, I think there's something rather elegant and rather wonderful that was set up by AstraZeneca in combination with the National Health Service, where you could galvanize tens of thousands of patients in an organized fashion to try new medicines, and a not-for-profit organization to evaluate which medicines should be put into that system. It doesn't necessarily mean that they won't make profit for the individuals at the end, but what is the merit of using the national health system to feed in a boatload of different therapeutics if you don't think they're going to work? So there was a very elegant, thought-through program that I think is going to yield some results. And that's really down to Mene Panagalos and the leadership at AstraZeneca taking a step forward and doing what is right medically and scientifically. In the United States, you think about what Regeneron did. These are, George Yancopoulos basically went out there and said, what matters is science. We're going to run a scientific assessment. We're going to look at these IL-6 antibodies. We're going to see, do they have an effect? And I think the difficulty they face is they never had the same level of organized medical clinical trials that you could do. But they did it. They did it, no question, the same as Genentech. It was a little bit more haphazard, a little bit more diverse, but they were able to do it. To your point, though, with over 600 or roughly 600 clinical trials, getting your medicine into that waiting list that can then try it out on patients is a challenge, and it's one that requires a lot of thought. It's not the only one, Mike. I think this is not just, if you divide this into three pieces, you've got to find the right direction to go in scientifically, then run the right clinical test, which is the clinical trial, then make sure that the FDA has full understanding of the risks and benefits of whatever you're doing. And then when it comes to the last piece, do you have the manufacturing capacity, particularly for viruses, for vaccines, that can enable all of the stuff that you did before to be delivered in a way or produced in a way that then can be delivered to patients. So to me, there's a multiplicity of different steps that all have to come together in the right way. It's not just having the most exciting science. Everything else needs to be lined up.
Fantastic. And we'll have to be respectful of time because we're eating up the minutes as we're going. But so maybe go all the way back to the kind of sweep of the book. We face reputational challenges. We face, challenges from the pandemic, from government. If you were to hope that the book would have an impact, you mentioned the historical perspective. Are there other more immediate, aspirations for having people encounter this book?
Yes, it's the recognition that biotechnology and this industry is strategic. This is the entity that stepped forward to fight the virus. Nobody asked in January the two companies that were the only two or three companies that were working then to expand their programs. Nobody asked 500 other companies, or actually it's a little less than that, it's about 300, to start new programs. The industry stepped forward. In January, the industry was facing an existential threat with congressional bills, Senate bills, and White House ideas, all of which were clashing, but they had one common theme, and that was to rein in and focus only on prices. That was all. But in many of them, their ideas, while very meritorious in some cases, particularly for old drugs that should never be increasing in price every year, ones which are way off patent or ones that have just had minimal investment in and that haven't moved forward, except people just raise their prices because they could. But those bills were constructed in a way which could profoundly damage the innovation, which is what is biotech. And so I'm hoping that while many of those bills, particularly that of Senator Grassley, has a lot to be commended for it, there are many others that need to be stepped back and take a read of this book, understand the risk that the industry faces unless one says, how can one preserve, nurture, and expand this industry while at the same time stopping bad actors at the other end of the scale, exploiting the medical system to their benefit and to the exclusion of the population. So I think the immediate story that comes out of this is, and not just the historical one, is I hope that people read this and say, this is a really important industry to us. And we need to rely on it and we need to nurture it. That's not necessarily why I wrote the book. I hope that's what they will learn from it, as well as the human nature of this industry. And so the idea of us being a piñata to gain political scores is exactly what you don't want. That is why we have the pandemic sweeping over America. It was a political piñata as opposed to a medical problem. And we have right now an industry which is focused on medicines, innovation, and patients. Let's keep the focus there as opposed to anything else.
That was a fantastic way to summarize, I think, what the book did for me, because a lot of these voices are voices either people I've known or spoken to or seen on Twitter. Getting the chance to listen to them in prose was really very wonderful. So first of all, thank you for the idea of the book and for getting it done in such a elegant manner and so quickly. And thank you for your time today, Jeremy. This has been wonderful.
Mike, it's a pleasure. Thanks for your time, and thank you very much for letting me see that wonderful looking cat that you've got there. It's great.
My little man cave, yes.
Yep, wonderful. Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.